Words can explode like bombs. So said Katrine Aspas, the journalist for Norway's biggest broadsheet, Aftenposten, in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo shootings. In the same paper a few days later, Camilla Sordal went further, saying, "If you ask for trouble, you'll get trouble." The reaction from some quarters was fast and furious. The comic strip, Skarpe Kanter, or Sharp Edges, can I get PowerPoint? Here we go. Was quick to caricature such statements as a slap in the face for the victims. Around their cabin log fire with their glasses of wine, the two comic characters muse that the families of the Charlie Hebdo victims would be oh so comforted by these platitudes and their repetition by their political supporters, amongst them Jonas Gahr Støre, the leader of the Norwegian opposition party. Do words explode like bombs? Can the pen actually strike like a sword? Can we draw such a parallel? And is it a useful way to both attack the shootings and at the same time express deep disagreement with cartoons that sometimes seem overladen with provocative Islamophobia? Is it a way to straddle the binary Twitter hashtag well of Je suis Charlie and Je ne suis pas Charlie, I am Charlie, I am not Charlie? Or is yet this idea that words can explode like bombs another example of tolerance and multiculturalism gone awry? In my view, the statement by Katrina is both very wrong and very right. I'm not trying to have it both ways. I'm not trying to split the middle. It's partly because simple slogans too easily mix morality and empiricism, moral responsibility and empirical causality. But it's also because the debate is focused so much on the virtues and limits of freedom of expression, and perhaps not enough on the causes and consequences of violence. And when we saw today the shooting of that police officer, we have to stop and ponder. The notion that words can explode like bombs is clearly wrong in moral terms. The danger with this metaphor is that it equates the most grotesque form of physical violence, murder, with acts of speech. It is a form of moral equivalence that is unjustifiable, unsustainable. It doesn't satisfy the basic criteria for a criminal legal offence, as any lawyer will know. There's no actus reus, there's no physical act. There's no mens rea, not even, in most cases, an intention to kill. So even when we want to find an empirical understanding for why people commit violence, we must not let our brains, our moral faculties, switch off. We have to pause and condemn it. But to condemn violence is not necessarily to give oneself over to a typical conservative political agenda, which has appropriated the security agenda, counterterrorism, and so forth. We have to remember that more progressive forces, and amongst them perhaps most cartoonists, have always sought to tackle physical violence as much as structural violence and social discrimination and due process rights for criminal suspects. Across the world, women struggle to make violence against women a criminal offence and to make prosecution stick. Civil rights movements have fought to remove state-sanctioned violence in the form of the death penalty and other cruel and degrading treatments, and decried the collateral damage of war, particularly by Western countries. Criminal law reformers have attacked the common and absurd priorities in many legal systems, even today, which favour powerful elites over the marginalised, which penalise property offenders more than rapists, and devote inordinate police resources to tracking down gay men, drug users, and the homeless, while the victims of real crime are left puzzled and angry at the failure of states to effectively prevent and remediate violence. In Oslo, homelessness is being criminalised. In Norway, petty drug use is criminalised. It's remarkable how much police resources are dedicated to that and not stronger forms of violence. I'm an Australian, and don't hold that against me. We have a long criminal history. 226 years ago, my ancestor Hugh Hughes stole 1/2 pound of lead. You know, what is that worth today? I don't know, 20 kroner, 100 kroner. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and put on a boat to Australia. At the very same time, a British aristocrat murdered one of his servants in cold blood and got 30 days in prison. When you see that kind of relativity, you can only shake your head at the absurdity of it. We should not stop shaking our heads at it, for it continues today. And whether it is two brothers storming Charlie Hebdo's offices in the name of Islam, or whether it is Anders Behring Breivik in the name of Christian civilization, if we sign off as hashtag I am Charlie, then we should also be prepared to sign off as hashtag I am the Labour Party, the target of Breivik's attacks, and vice versa. And we should also consider, if we're going to make statements like words explode like bombs, who are our friends? Well, often they're governments, and quite repressive ones at times. Here we have a very famous South African cartoonist, Sapiro, who has mercilessly attacked the South African leader Zuma, always with a shower cap on his head, as this was a way of getting rid of HIV after sexual activity. And here's Zuma saying, careful, his pen is loaded. And of course, you have the whole state and police apparatus ready to shoot the cartoonist. Zuma seems to believe that words can explode like bombs and is ready to take action. But at another level, words do function like bombs. Indeed, Aspas's statement was actually taken from a cartoonist in Verge who said, I cannot go around exploding bombs all the time. But the metaphor is not quite right. Words do not have the same immediate and explosive effect. It's better to think of them perhaps more as a fuselage or gunpowder in a bomb. And this is perhaps for scientific reasons, because research on the causes of violence shows how important words and images are in shaping our behavior and potency, our potential for violence. Of course, you have one school of thought, the political realists, the Marxist sociologists, who say that the causes of violence are material. It's people fighting over the distribution of resources. Any use of words is merely incidental to that. And they're partly right, but obviously partly wrong. Who makes up the ranks of terrorists around the world? Who are their leaders? They're mostly middle class and rich men. They're not the marginalized. Even our own Anders Behring Breivik. In other schools of thought, violence is more intrinsic to us and finds its origin in psychology and our social relations. It is a product of othering, where we build our identity on the basis of others' differences. It is a product of scapegoating, as we seek to find others to carry the blame for our personal or social failures. So scapegoating, the secret to success is knowing who to blame. It is also the product of social learning, and particularly spiraling narratives of hate, built assiduously by our peers or political and religious entrepreneurs whose ends may not be simply material. And here we see a ladder of hate which builds up on these different elements until we get to burning hate, annihilation, and genocide. It's a process that any normal person, one could almost think, can go through, as we saw in Germany, as we saw in Rwanda. But the causes of violence are also in our brains. There is clearly some difference amongst us in our propensity to cause violence, not even to speak of mental illness and other psychological difficulties. But it's not only that. Our biological capacity to accommodate difference varies amongst people. In all of these four different accounts of violence, words and images play a role. They're critical, at times, if not essential, to building up that pattern of violence. The biological explanation might seem the strangest, but it's fascinating what particularly researchers in the US have found in experimental studies. When subjects see faces of black men, all of them have a reaction in the amygdala, in the back of the brain, which is where our emotions are driven from. But those who are less racist or have more positive attitudes against black people had more frontal cortex activity here, controlling their fears and emotions. People differed in their neural makeup. But what was interesting is when they showed some people photos of, say, black men looking after children, images. Afterwards, those subjects were able to control those emotions much more in their brain. Images are important. A single cartoon, though, does not a massacre make, as Shakespeare might have said. But an avalanche of cartoons, combined with overarching narratives, may contribute to the escalating tensions between the so-called Islamic and Western civilizations. As Gandhi responded when he was asked what he thought about Western civilization, he said, well, it sounds like a good idea. Words and images form part of the causal apparatus that both boosts and reduces violence. Indeed, the Islamophobes, they argue that religious texts, Muslim texts, lead to violence. Well, maybe. But what about their own texts? Do they also contribute to violence? This brings us back to the freedom of expression, the subject of today's seminar. Is there a right to draw Muhammad? Is there a right to draw many pictures of him? Is there a right to denigrate him? The reaction around the world to the Charlie Hebdo shootings showed that there's a significant and diverse amount of support in multiple countries around the world, including Muslim countries, but also opposition. The more difficult question is how we should morally exercise that right. Indeed, while half the world tweeted Voltaire's famous statement, je suis Voltaire, there was a lot of people tweeting that as well. Even though I violently disagree with you, I will defend to the death your right to say what you want to say. But nobody tweeted Voltaire's anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish statements. He was consistently anti-Semitic. It's on this question we need to draw on our empirical understandings and be reflexive. We need to recognize that there are many of us who stand between, say, a fundamentalist, romantic, militant, secular approach to freedom of speech and a fundamentalism religion that is shrill in calling for self-censorship or forced censorship. And both fundamentalisms feed off each other, denying a space for a large, reasonable middle. In the second part of her article, Aspas provides some nice daily tips for not getting too fired up over religion and needlessly polarizing, generating more heat than light. In my view, a useful place to start is critical modernity. And that's a highfalutin sort of sociological, concept. But what I mean by that is three things. A critical modernity says, yes, there can be multiple modernities and identities. People can have very different frames about the world and how they think. I can tolerate that, but I'm not going the full relativist, postmodernist approach. I'm still going to use reason and rationality. I'm still going to criticize. The second part of critical modernity is to always be suspicious of powerful elites. On one hand, that means religious elites that use religious texts and their positions for oppressive purposes. But we should also be suspicious of ourselves as Western elites and how we use text and images. Are we really at all times fighting global Islam as powerful force? Or are we denigrating and attacking a vulnerable and marginalized Muslim minority in Europe? The question should be posed particularly to our political leaders who all rushed off to Paris, Je suis Charlie, fighting to be in front of the leaders from states as they marched down the streets of Paris. And then they rushed home to limit freedom of expression even more. What did Erna Solberg come back to Norway and do? The first thing, almost in the week after, was to propose a ban on begging in Norway, a clear violation of the freedom of expression. What did the Australian Prime Minister do? Came back with proposals to limit what Muslim youth can say when they get frustrated with Afghanistan and Iraq. We should be careful of all power and all elites. And lastly, critical modernity is never satisfied with easy answers. It calls for evidence. If we say that a muscular secularism will lead to better societies, healthy, happy, and rational, do we have evidence? If we say that a nice liberal tolerance will also create such societies, do we have the evidence? We need to keep on asking these sorts of questions and find a way between the two fundamentalisms. Thank you.